Hello, and thank you very much for listening to this talk. So, my talk starts with the work I've been doing on values and decision making in the Supreme Court. And the work that I do centers on cases that divide judicial opinion, so the most difficult cases in the court. And what I've started to show is this kind of differential pattern of expression in the judgments on either side of the case on the different outcomes. So you see those who agree on the disposition of a case, so those on one side prioritizing values, a single value or a set of values above others, and those on the other side prioritizing a different set of values. So what you start to see is values, a decision in these really difficult cases becoming a value decision, where a judge prioritizes a value or a set of values above others. And what's of interest to me for this talk and for the work I'm doing now is a pattern that started to emerge in these cases for individual judges. Now, I apologize to these judges for using them as examples, but what I'm trying to show here is this consistent pattern of decision making in the most difficult cases, the cases that divide judicial opinion. Now, here we have Lord Reid, who's the current president of the Supreme Court, and beneath him, four different values: self-direction, which is freedom and autonomy; universalism, equality, the protection of the vulnerable; conformity and tradition, the prioritization of kind of rules, adherence to rules, adherence to legal principles and legal traditions. And what you can see in these cases that divide judicial opinion is that Lord Reid will consistently reach a decision that aligns with conformity if conformity is opposed to any other value. Indeed, he does this in 82% of cases that divide judicial opinion. Lord Kerr, who recently passed away, is the opposite. He will prioritize self-direction and freedom and autonomy and universalism, equality, protection of the vulnerable above other values. Indeed, in cases that divide judicial opinion, he prioritizes these values in 86% of cases. And Lady Hale here is a very good example of somebody who's neutral on these value positions. For these specific values, she's 50-50. She'll go either direction. And so the question I'm trying to resolve in the work I'm doing now is how this kind of consistent pattern of decision making aligns with our understanding of judicial bias. Because our understanding of judicial bias is inherently negative. We talk about it in context of inequality, discrimination, disadvantage, and increasingly, even these less conscious biases in the context of implicit bias are also inherently negative. They're seen to disadvantage people based on race or gender or class. But the work I do on values is anchored in psychology. And bias in that context is not anchored in those negative understandings. It's a normal facet of our decision making. It's simply a nudge in a specific direction. And to understand, I suppose, how this works, we could look at the work of Cahill O'Callaghan. And this is a really simplified version of what he, sorry, I flicked a slide, of what he's arguing. But at the heart of his argument is this two-system method of decision making. And what he says is that we initially have this very instinctive response, this gut reaction, a quick involuntary intuition, which is a reflex. And this is our biases. These are our heuristics. These are our nudge in a specific direction. We have a second system, the second system of reasoning, which is slow and deliberative and analytical and effortful. And our decisions are into a kind of relationship between 1 and 2. And although typically we would consider judicial decision making as this slow, effortful system two type decision making, in reality, it's a combination of both. In reality, it is both system one and the biases that are inherent in system one and system two. But bias in this context is not inherently negative, nor does it kind of have the characteristics of bias that we can assume when we discuss judicial bias. It's really highly sophisticated. It is not at all irrational. It is not exceptional. And it is really not negative. What it is a highly complex intuitive predisposition or nudge to view a choice in a specific way. And our values function in that way. Our values are the way we see the world. They're instinctive, they're the first response, they frame our decision making. But what I'm trying to resolve, I suppose, in this paper or consider in this paper is when do these values stop becoming something inherently normal in our decision making process and become something less acceptable? When do these kind of instinctive responses and inherent biases become unacceptable? And again, I returned to the work on judicial bias and started to look for a method, a process to understand the distinction between acceptable and unacceptable. And Judge Owsley in Cummins and Camden provided that, because the distinction he was making in that case was between a predisposition and predetermination. And the argument was that a predisposition, a nudge in a certain direction, is not fundamentally unacceptable. It becomes unacceptable when you predetermined the case. When that predisposition is so strong that you can't be moved away from it. And so if we think of values within that continuum, then our values are situated as a predisposition. And as long as they remain there, as long as they don't predetermine the outcome, that's completely acceptable. And actually, that aligns with our psychological understandings of decision making. It is completely normal. And so the question then is, what characteristics, misspelled on the slide, what characteristics of an individual judge should we be seeking to ensure that these values, these heuristics, these biases remain simply a predisposition? And the obvious one of those is open-mindedness, that you're open to persuasion. And I apologize to Lord Sumption here for taking this quote from Alan Patterson's wonderful book, but it does articulate what I'm trying to say. So Lord Sumption says that he has an instinctive feeling, and we all agree that that's completely normal. It's a heuristic, it's a bias, it's a normal response. You have an instinctive feeling, and he's right in suggesting that everybody does. But what he then goes on to articulate is how rarely he is persuaded away from that instinctive feeling. And what we require from our judges is an open-mindedness. We need them to be persuaded away. We need this simply to be a predisposition. It's the way you frame and see the world, but you are persuaded away from it. And what Lord Sumption also notes here, which is the effect of other individuals in moving you away from that position. So the real importance in the Supreme Court of panel decision making, but also those members of the panel. And here he highlights expertise and the requirement for expertise to nudge him away from his predisposition. And Chris Hanratty has written a wonderful book on expertise, so can I commend that to you. And so we know that we need alternative views. And there's extensive work that shows that being persuaded by somebody else to change your position refines decision making. It's the central thesis of Cass Sunstein's book on why society needs dissent, is the idea that conformity perpetuates bias. And we need it, perpetuates predispositions to a point where they become predeterminations. So we need people to challenge in the court. We need challenges in the court to refine decision making, but also to ensure that these simply remain predispositions. And then, so we have to look to the structure and the culture and the individuals on the court, those who will express difference. We need a court that accepts and in fact treasures difference on the court. And in the absence of these things, we start to shift from predisposition to predetermination. And it's in this context that I present this data and maybe a concern that I hope will not become a reality, but it is certainly a concern. And that is the decreasing tendency of the court to express difference. Now, Alan's book has extensive examples, absolutely extensive examples of how difference is articulated behind closed doors, but I simply have evidence of difference that's overt. So that would be the expression of difference or division in the court. And what you can see in the numbers here is that during Lord Philip's tenure, the division was quite frequent. It happened in about 26% of cases, but that's increasingly dropping. And although now these numbers are slightly dated and it's starting to increase again with Lord Reid, it has never again achieved Lord Phillips's rate of division. And that's of concern, because if we want challenge in the court, you would expect it to be expressed externally. And that challenge is so essential to ensuring that these predispositions remain just that. And so at the heart of the paper, I suppose, is this call that we use our understandings of psychology and values and bias to ensure and encourage the court to not only appoint judges who are open-minded and open to persuasion, but also to start to appoint difference, people who are happy to express that difference, and to ensure to maintain a culture that encourages difference rather than consensus, so that the values and the biases that those values could affect remain simply acceptable, inherent heuristics, and rather than a predetermination of the outcome of the case. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.